Okay, great. So welcome everyone to the last APCG of this semester, of this year, 2021. We're really honored to have Maxine Rubin discussing her paper called Analyzing African Agency, African States' Relations with the International Criminal Court. Her discussants are Phil Clark and Oumar Ba. I want to make sure that we give the full time to Maxine. So maybe Maxine, you take just a couple of minutes to give us kind of a preview of the paper. We expect that everyone has already read the paper. I circulated it. And then we'll give Phil and Oumar about 15 minutes each to give you feedback, and then we'll open it up to questions. So I'll hand it over to Maxine. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time. So briefly, my paper, Analyzing African Agency, African States' Relations with the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, aims to identify the main factors that explain African states' behavior in relation to the ICC during what I call the withdrawal debate, which is a period from about 2009 until 2018, where there were recurrent calls from some African states for collective withdrawal from the court to dissatisfaction with its investigations on the continent, particularly with regards to the Darfur and Kenyan situations. And what I find interesting about this period is that African states parties, which just means members of the International Criminal Court, do not adopt a shared stance about this issue. Some call for withdrawal, others accuse the ICC of being neo-imperialist, but don't make efforts to exit. Others staunchly support the court, and others remain relatively silent about the matter. And this variance in behavior demonstrates different ways that African states parties have exercised their agency within international relations in response to competing interests and obligations, particularly those of the AU and ICC. And so I'm interested in what explains this variance. And to do this, I've studied all of the African states' behaviors regarding the withdrawal debate. The number changes over years. One leaves, a couple join along the way. So I haven't attributed a number to this, but it's about 34 states. And I apply Albert Hirschman's exit voice and loyalty model to this case. I've chosen this model because it was developed to analyze behavior in response to dissatisfaction with organizations. And I argue that the withdrawal debate is an example of a perceived period of decline in the ICC by some African states. I measure behavior, which I see as an indicator of agency, with country statements delivered between 2008 and 2018 at the ICC Assembly States Parties General Debates, the UN General Assembly's annual ICC report plenary sessions, and the UN General Assembly's general debates. So given that there are protocols that shape the way that country statements are delivered in these forums, I use discourse analysis as a method to interpret if the statements convey messages overall that indicate exit, voice, or loyalty, where I've defined exit as withdrawing from the court, so terminating that relationship. Voice refers to criticisms that are leveled against the ICC, and loyalty refers to support for the ICC. And the classification of the individual country statements into one of these three behavioral categories for each year is used really as a point of departure for analyzing the causes of the different behavior. And in my analysis, I look at 5 explanatory variables, which I've drawn from the prevalent literature about Africa's international relations. And I supplement the country statement data with additional sources such as withdrawal notifications, reservations on AU decisions, interview data, news articles, and academic sources. And the variables that are discussed are head of state interests, regional politics, domestic factors, reputational factors, and economic factors. Okay, so in a nutshell, I found that behavior was caused by different combinations of these variables, but generally, we could say that exit is best explained by head of state interest, very unsurprising. Voice behavior is best explained by regional politics, And loyalty behavior was best explained by reputational and economic factors, but it was very difficult to delineate reputational and economic factors from one another. But most importantly, perhaps, is explanations of behavior are not monocausal, and different combinations of these variables in different years best explained behavioral outcomes. And hopefully I've managed to convey some of this complexity in my paper. I found the exit voice and loyalty model was very useful for studying the withdrawal debate because it allowed for this comparative analysis of behavior across states and across time, while recognizing behavior as complicated and dynamic. It had the advantage of recognizing that there's an interplay between the different behavioral categories, which means it allows for this multi-causal explanation of behavior and avoids being too reductionist while still being relatively simple. And the withdrawal case, in turn, suggests that the exit voice and loyalty model perhaps should be refined for the purposes of international relations studies by distinguishing between two different types or subtypes of voice and loyalty, and that this nuance might be important given that exit is quite unlikely in this context of international organizations, since there aren't very often easy alternatives for states to join. So yeah, briefly, that is what my paper is about and what I found. Thank you so much for taking the time to engage with it, and I'm really looking forward to hearing everyone's feedback.
Great, thanks Maxine for that overview. So I will go in alphabetical order by last name and hand it over to Oumar for discussion comments.
Thank you, Justine. That's been one of the downsides of having with a last name that starts with B, so you get to go first. Thanks, Maxine, for this great paper, and I'm grateful to also share this space with Phil, who I've known for many years, and I'm a big fan of Phil's work, as you probably all know. I did enjoy reading this this paper, and in fact, I do not have many comments, but I just wanted to raise two issues slash questions. But before I get there, this article does contribute greatly to our understanding, I think, of the variation within African states and their behaviors over time, but also across different contexts and events. And more crucially, the article also shows how the behavior of African states, one could, I guess, even argue all states, how the behavior here towards international norms and international institutions is highly contingent on both internal and external factors. And Maxine does classify those factors within interest of, she talks about the heads of states, but I would say probably interest of the political elites, because the subject matter of ICC jurisdiction dealing sometimes with conflict situations, we know also that the political and the military elite in a broader sense do have a lot of interest in monitoring how vulnerable they could be towards the ICC. And beside the interest of the political elites, also there's the regional politics and alliances, the domestic factors, the economic factors, and finally the reputational cost. So these are the different factors that plays into how African states, or all states for that matter, would behave while calculating how to engage with international norms in a broader sense. And also, I think Maxine does a great job discussing the caveats that are included in trying to apply the exit voice and loyalty frame to this political, not commercial, not market-based context, but also applying this model to a state-level unit of analysis rather than the individual unit of analysis, which is what Hirschman had did before. But let me raise one additional concern or question here about the application of the exit voice and loyalty model as applied to this context of African states' relation with the ICC. Hirschman mentions, and Maxine quotes this as well, that a basic tenet of this model is that in the context of discontent with the perceived decline of an organization, individuals will exit the relationship with the organization. And I want to highlight here that the discontent in this model comes from the perceived decline of the organization. So it is not a discontent towards the organization per se, but it is a discontent that is born out of a perceived decline of the institution. Now, my question here is whether the ICC was perceived to be in decline during the withdrawal debate during this decade, 2008-2018, or even at any moment, because it seems to me that, or at least I'm raising this question because I want to hear more whether the states that exited or threatened to exit or voiced their grievances, whether they did so out of a perception that the institution was in decline. I guess one could even argue the opposite, because wasn't it the case that the states felt that the institution, that the ICC was overreaching, that the ICC was overextending its powers and its mandates, and that the ICC was in fact constituting a bigger threat to the states or the elites, more than what they had anticipated. I think the articles could benefit with addressing this question, this caveat. There is a sense that Maxine tried to evade the question somewhat when you quoted that Francisca Boemi, quote, rightfully identifies the withdrawal debate as an indicator that the ICC is perceived to be in a state of decline by its African state parties. But is it really the case? And do you in fact agree with Francie here that African states did perceive the ICC to be in decline, which has motivated those who exited or threatened to exit or raise their voices? So that was one of the main questions that I wanted to raise. The second one, and I commend you really, this is a great work you did here by looking at all the statements that all these states made across a decade, and that's really a painstaking work. But looking at the tables, I decided for whatever reason to just look at how many states had made no statement at all, or just one state during the 10-year period. And I found that 1/3 of the states made only one statement or no statement at all related to the ICC at the Assembly of State Party meetings during the 10-year period. At the UN ICC report plenary sessions, I found that 67% of the states made only one statement or no statement at all during the decade. And that percentage goes to 88% at the UN General Assembly debates. So I do understand that it's harder to analyze what motivates a silence. It's much easier to analyze what someone says rather than why they didn't say anything. But I'm just curious to know what's your take on this? Why were so many states, I don't want to say indifferent, but at least this debate, this withdrawal debate, didn't rise to a point of concern that they felt the need to say anything about the ICC during 10 years, or to mention the ICC in their statements only once during that 10-year period. Can we construe their silence as loyalty? Is it indifference? And what does this tell us? And one final minor point here. Well, two minor points. There were a number of African states that joined the ICC after the withdrawal debate. So after 2018, that includes the Seychelles, Tunisia, Cape Verde Islands, and Ivory Coast. And I wonder what you make of that. And the final point has to do, and you rightly mentioned that you could not use the states of voting patterns as an indication of their behavior, because the ICC, Assembly of State Parties, typically operate on a consensus basis, not on a vote basis. That's a great point. You could possibly add that this is by design, actually. It's not by accident that rulemaking and lawmaking at all these institutions have tended to be based on consensus rather than vote. And this actually, the shift to consensus occurred after World War II, during the decolonization period, where you had an influx of newly independent countries from the global south into the international arena, and the Western states did not want to lose that leverage. So they switched from a voting-based lawmaking template to a consensus building one. I will stop there. Thank you again for this great paper.
Great, thanks, Oumar. And we'll hand it over to Phil.
Great, thanks, Justine. Thanks to the APCG, and also thanks to Maxine for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I'm also delighted to be with Oumar on this panel. I'm also delighted to see some old friends in the virtual audience, Richard, Hugo, Geoffrey, and others. This is how we have to meet these days, is through the beauty of the computer screen. So let me say up front that look, Maxine, as you know, because I've spoken to you about your great work before, I really enjoyed this paper, which will be of no surprise to you. I think it examines a truly underexplored issue around the ICC, which is difficult to do because there's a huge literature around the court. But I think that analysing African states' agency towards the court is a crucial theme. And I don't think that there's been enough attention paid to it. I think Oumar is one of the few other people who's really looked at this systematically, but I think that your paper is a crucial contribution to the literature on this issue. I also think it's incredibly useful to bring the ICC into an international relations and an international organizations set of debates. Clearly, this has been a literature for a long time dominated by international criminal lawyers. I think you do us all a huge service by pulling the court kicking and screaming into another literature where it also belongs. I also think in more specific terms, the paper does a really fantastic job of categorizing different types of African state agency towards the court. I think you found a really nice, neat apparatus to tell us a lot in a very short space. I think your use of discourse analysis, looking at all of these states' statements in these very important international arenas is a really insightful way of dealing with a huge amount of material. I also think the fact that you track that material over time and give us a sense of some of the fluctuations in that state behavior is also something that hasn't really been fully captured in a lot of the existing analysis. I also think, as Oumar has already said, the fact that you track these variations across the continent, showing that this is clearly not a homogeneous Africa reacting towards the court, but actually there's a huge amount of heterogeneous behavior going on is also crucial. So I think there are some really major contributions that you're making here. And I think for that reason, this is an article that stands a very good chance of being published very soon in a high impact journal. So with that in mind, with the hope that this does end up in a very prominent journal, I want to raise 4 things that you might want to think about in terms of revising the paper. 3 of them are very general, 1 of them is very, very specific. The first issue that I want to raise is a question of scope, the scope of the paper. Because in the introduction, you say that this analysis is going to focus principally on the withdrawal issue. But when you get into the crux of the argument, it seems to me your analysis actually ends up going much wider than that. That this is more than just about how African states reacted in those particular debates around 2016 and 2017. And it seems to me maybe you use the withdrawal issue as a hook, as a way into the paper, but then I'm not sure why you would want to limit yourself. It strikes me, actually, you've got material there that is much bigger than just that particular period, and you might just want to embrace that and say that you're looking at African states' behaviour towards the court in a much wider time frame. Because actually it strikes me by the time we get to the crux of your analysis that maybe the debates around the withdrawal issue weren't the most important moments of African agency vis-a-vis the court. That the sting went out of those debates pretty quickly. And actually, there were other moments that seemed more important, like the arrest warrants for Bashir, for Kenyatta, or for Ruto, that they seemed to catalyse much more vociferous, much more varied African agency, all of which you do talk about in the analysis in the later part of the paper. Maybe you just want to embrace that reality a little bit more. Also staying with the scope issue, I understand why you're focusing on African states that have signed up to the court. Basically those states that are inside the tent. I think the paper might, at the outset, just need a little bit of clarity around where other actors fit into the analysis. So I'm thinking here particularly of very influential non-signatories like Sudan and Rwanda. Two states that have, for their own reasons, been very opposed to the court, that have shaped all sorts of Africa-wide debates. I just wonder where they fit into your analysis. I also wonder about the African Union as an actor, because the AU crops up time and again in the later part of your paper. It raises the question for me about whether you need to acknowledge the AU up front as a key African actor operating across the continent, or is it a subordinate player in your analysis? And I also wonder where the ICC itself fits into your analysis, because it strikes me that there's a dialectical relationship between the court and many African states, that the court makes up its mind about certain African states and how they're likely to behave and then operates accordingly. It tends to be very sympathetic towards some African states because of the stances that they've taken, and it seems to want to discipline other African states. So this one's, I think, a question in the introduction about how you describe the role of these other important actors in your overall analysis. I think it's fine to keep the focus on ICC signatory states, but it perhaps just needs a bit of clarity about where these other key actors fit into the scope of the paper as a whole. So that's the first issue, and I'm going to be much briefer, I can promise you, on the remaining three points. The second point is about theory and method, and again, I think Oumar's already touched on this in some detail. In the conclusion, you raise some really important limitations of Hirschman's theory around exit voice and loyalty. And you propose some improvements to that theorization. It strikes me that's absolutely right. I think what you say in the conclusion makes perfect sense, and I think you've justified it. My question would be, why not build that back upwards into your treatment of the empirical material? So, for example, you talk about how you need to disaggregate loyalty into passive and active loyalty. And you would need to disaggregate voice into threatening and constructive voice. And I think your material absolutely shows good reason to do that. My question then would be, why not build that back up into the table and actually show that you're improving on the theory, and that improvement then colours all of your empirical analysis. So take what you've already said in the conclusion and run with it. Just on your table, one of the things that struck me was that, and this might be a question about how you code particular states. I'm interested in the fact that you never code Kenya red. even though it never itself said that it wanted to exit the court, it was clearly mobilizing some kind of AU-wide agitation towards exit. So I think that might then be a question about what constitutes exit. How strong does your exit have to be to get a red, basically? And there might be other examples, but Kenya was the one that really struck me. The third issue is a temporal one. And this isn't really something for improvement, it's just a question that I have is, do you see a link between what African states thought they were signing up to in Rome and how they behaved thereafter? So, what exactly is the influence on African state behavior? I mean, this links, I think, to the withdrawal issue question. Is it the debate around withdrawal that dictates different states' behavior, or is it something else? Is it, for example, that they signed up in Rome believing that the court would do certain things, for example, constraining the power of major international players, and then out of a sense of disappointment with the court, they then threatened to withdraw or express their discontent. So I just wonder what the time frame is and what the driver is for some of these states' behavior. That also, I think, includes the fact that donors, you talk a lot about donor pressure in the paper, particularly European Union pressure. I think that pressure was evident from Rome onwards. I think that in explaining why these states signed up to the court in the first place, I don't think we can ever discount the pressure of donors, including the European Union. And Kevin Coffey has done some really interesting, he's at University College Dublin, he's done some really interesting work on this around the influence of USAID, the EU and other donors in Rome in driving certain states, certain African states to sign up. So it might be worth looking at. The final thing, and this is the very specific one, is about South Africa. So I wanted to bring this back to your own turf. I was interested at the end of the paper when you're looking at the different explanatory factors that you don't include South Africa in the discussion of head of state influence. And I wondered what you think about this. How significant is the transition from Zuma to Ramaphosa in explaining the change in South Africa's stance? And I think this also connects to a later point that you make about domestic versus regional factors in South Africa's decision-making. I think undoubtedly the regional calculations around Bashir's visit, South Africa's desire for influence at the AU level is a big part of that. But also, isn't there an important domestic motivation with Zuma in that at the time, he was on the attack against all courts, against all judicial institutions, both domestic and international. And that at least part of the antagonism towards the courts seemed to come from his own view of courts constraining the power of the executive. So it's about him as an individual, but it's also about a very domestic set of dynamics about his relationship towards judicial institutions. So you know that case infinitely better than I do. So I pose that very much as a question and would be very interested to hear your thoughts on it. So it's a great paper. It'll get published. I hope it gets published soon. And yeah, hopefully some of these comments help with that process. Thanks.
Great. So I'm going to give Maxine a couple minutes to respond if she's interested. And then if other audience members have questions, if you could use the raise hand function and I'll keep a list.
Great. Thank you so much to Oumar and Phil. That was very helpful, and hopefully I can address some of these questions sufficiently. Some of them I'm going to have to think about. Okay, so I'm going to start with Oumar's. So the first one around the connection between the motivation of exit as a result of the perception of decline and maybe not developing that discussion enough. I think that's a very good point, and I hadn't. As I think most of you all know, this is based on my dissertation research, and I go into a lot more detail there, and kind of elaborating on why we can see this period as one as a perception of decline. But I think what's your point is making me think is I need to be quite overt about, yeah, this link around motivation, because I don't think that the motivations for behavior are caused by this perceived decline, and that does make a difficulty around, with the model. So most instances where people use this model, they actually just use the concepts, they just use the words exit, voice, and loyalty, and they don't really use the kind of theoretical thinking, which has been quite a difficult part in executing this research, because very few academics have actually taken it to the international level. Francesca is the only one who has done it looking at the ICC with a different case pool. So I think I overlooked kind of going into this kind of this relationship between the decline as a motivating factor or as an explanatory factor. And I need to visit very carefully what Hirschman says and then address that in my discussion. And I think it's just about kind of explaining, well, this is what it's been rhetorically presented as. I think rhetorically, states have explained their discontent as this kind of perceived failing by the ICC, which relates back to what Phil is saying around these early hopes for the court. And this kind, and I'll get to that later, so maybe I shouldn't start talking about it now. But I think that that's a really good area that I need to refine. And so thank you very much for bringing that up. With regards to the statements and the ones that, and basically the question of, well, how do we interpret silence? That's actually one of the main things I was really, really excited about doing this project on. And Susie Graham's done a lot of research into kind of abstention and silences and in the Human Rights Council. And so we had like a very excited discussion around that. Basically, it is, as you say, very difficult to interpret silence. I have a few kind of ideas. And one of the limitations I note specifically is, well, not everyone actually thinks the ICC is that important, right? So like not every state is actually putting resources into responding to this. They don't really care. It's hard to measure that. And I think that's something where, there would need another kind of project where you would try to take stock of like, well, how important is the ICC for your foreign policy other than just signing on? In my thesis, I say that there's a category of states that kind of do the bare minimum. They join, possibly because of the reputational gains of being associated with the ICC, with these norms around international criminal justice, and then they do the bare minimum to stay in it. So Mauritius gives one speech, right? And I think that Mauritius is a good example of this. We know that its international reputation is very much around being seen as conforming to good governance norms, and the ICC fits into this kind of narrative. And I think that we can call these states, I don't say this in the article because there wasn't really space depending which journal I submitted to, but my thesis, I propose we could call them kind of zombie states. It's based off of Julia Gray's article, which she writes about zombie IOs or regional organizations, which are there by name, but not really in action. And it's kind of the same with some of these states. You join, and again, I'll get to speaking about this question of, well, why do states join? But presumably some of them join for reputational gains, and then they stay because it's neither here nor, well, there's nothing to lose by staying because their relationship with the AU isn't really in jeopardy. Their relationship with their trade partners isn't really in jeopardy. So they kind of stay and they keep a low head. But that also could be they don't have the resources to really take very strong vociferous stances. So I think it's something which further research could also start looking at, who's deployed to the as delegates to these to the ICC and to the UN. I think those kind of very interpersonal delegate things are also very interesting to explore. Okay, sorry, I should also move a bit quicker with this. So states, African states that join the ICC during this withdrawal debate, and I think this does start touching on this question of why do states join, and it's quite difficult to know, without having without having kind of like this historical interview. In my research, so from the literature, no one really engages with this question. So I asked pretty much everyone I interviewed, why do you think African states joined? Because I just think it's a very interesting question, and for kind of looking at consequences, I think it's an important one to understand. Unfortunately, it's one of those, this needs more research, but some of my initial findings, and mostly informed by interviews, so the literature just says, the Rwanda genocide happened, Africa didn't want it to happen again, Africa joined, right? So they give this very collective reason for why Africa joined, which is extremely reductionist and like doesn't really engage in the politics of it. The civil society factors, I think civil society organizations are important. They do kind of compel some states to join. I don't know the extent of this. I just know that there was quite a coordinated movement around the continent. I think the most compelling answer has been there's this period in the late 90s and early 2000s where there was this mass rush of accession to international treaties on the continent that has legitimizing effects. I think this idea of donors is really important around legitimizing effects. But one of my interviewees also pointed out there's a power in being one of the largest regional bloc in joining treaties. So you do get kind of, one, you have a power to exercise, but you also do get recruited, right? If Africa joins these treaties, it's pretty much going to pass. So that there's something really interesting to explore there. So, kind of what's happening behind the doors. And some of my interviews suggested at the Rome conference, there was this like big moment of, is this actually going to pass? Is the Rome Statute going to pass? And you had like Norway running and trying to get like an African state to join and doing these like behind the door little negotiations. So my hunch is that a lot of these things are informal, uncaptured. It's very difficult to systematically record these influences. And sometimes it comes down to these like interpersonal, informal decisions. And so it is really hard to kind of give like a sweeping answer. If I do give one, it's probably a combination of these kind of reputational gains from joining the ICC and it being quite legitimizing. And I think it's really hard to ignore that there was a condition in the main trade agreement with the EU, which says you must support the Rome Statute. It just gets finally put into the Cotonou Agreement after most African states have joined in 2005. So it's hard to timeline that because my hunch would be this was on the EU's agenda before it got put into the agreement, but that again, like I don't have the evidence to really support my inclination there. So I kind of put it out there for further thoughts. And then you said, I think those were your questions, Oumar. And then Phil, okay, so thank you for pointing out around the scope of my paper and dealing with some of the other actors and putting them in. I'm sorry if I'm missing a question that was there, and please just prompt me again. I'm not seeing one that I flagged. So why was Kenya not coded red? Okay, so this is about how I defined exit, and this is actually an agreement, a disagreement I have with how Boehm operationalized the exit voice and loyalty model. So Hirschman's definition of exit is very much around termination of the relationship. And I think even, I'm surprised people aren't critiquing my operationalization of it because South Africa and the Gambia technically don't end up leaving, but my argument is that they communicate the intent to leave by adhering to Article 127, which is the notification of withdrawal, and then they just rescind that, and that's a shift in their behavior back to voice or loyalty. So Kenya doesn't actually exit in this way that I've defined it, which is in terms of the withdrawal clause. So they would be this very critical voice, and they had and I think it's really important actually that we see it as the threat of exit, the way that they use this as voice to get what they want. Because I think, well, it might have even been in our interview where you mentioned this, but it definitely came up in the interviews that Kenya pretty much knew it was you. They could, I think you said they can run rings around the ICC, right? Like Kenya had kind of already figured out that exit isn't going to play into its interests because it wasn't going to stop the cases that were already before the ICC. Leaving wasn't going to stop what was happening. So they could kind of, the best way that they could achieve what they wanted to was staying a member, not becoming an international pariah, which goes against a lot of their other foreign policy interests, exert their regional power, very favor at the domestic level, but still be this really like compliant member state of the ICC. They're like positively contributing to it. In the country statements, they're so lovely. They're just like, oh, you know, we should refine this rule in this way. This would really be much more efficient for the court, until 1 year where they get absolutely livid because like the UN had said something disparaging about like these threats of exit, and they took it really personally. But yeah, so Kenya's really interesting, and it's really exciting to see Geoffrey Lugano here, because I found his article looking at neocolonialism discourse in Kenya fascinating, and it was one of the first things I read when I started my thesis. So it's really nice to see you there. Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, so and around the South African case and head of state interests. Okay, so again, this also came up in our interview, and I do mention, I'm not sure in this article, but in my thesis, I do actually note that the shift in South Africa's politic or regime from Zuma to Ramaphosa is significant because of Ramaphosa's interest in redefining South Africa's international image and kind of going back to this Madiba magic era and international relations. And so there's this kind of convergence between our reputational interests and the particular head of state that we have here. But there were disagreements with some of the assessment around Zuma's vendetta. So in my thesis, I note this discussion, but I didn't really have room to develop it in my article. So maybe it's something that I should actually put in, reinsert or footnote as something which is quite interesting, because it is an interesting way that the head of state's interests explains a different type of behavior, which is, I mean, it's still voiced because South Africa kind of maintains this threat of leaving. Even under Ramaphosa, they leave it really opaque. And one of the explanations that Susie Graham gave for this kind of like opaqueness is South Africa wants to become a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It can't be seen to contradict a prior regime. So it kind of like, it's already been decided it's staying in. Domestically, we've kind of just let this fade. Like there's a bill that's meant to get us to exit, and it's not really going anywhere. Corona has hit, it's not an important domestic issue anymore. Ramaphosa's in. So it's quite interesting to see how this is playing out, but really, yeah, it's kind of like Zuma left, that faction within the ANC started, it didn't have as much power once Ramaphosa was in. And so they've kind of like, I think the sentiment has been like, let sleeping dogs lie. But yeah, like South Africa, watch me say this and then something happens, but South Africa is not going to leave the ICC. Yeah. I'm sorry if I've missed any questions. My handwriting is revolting to read under pressure. But maybe,
I was going to say, Maxine, yeah, you have a couple of questions, so maybe we'll collect them together, and that way we allow so you can get maximum feedback. So Megan, you have the first question.
Great. Hi. Thanks for sharing this work. It seems to me like, you know, it's clearly like a dissertation project. Like it's so ambitious in terms of the explanations that you're assessing here, and also the amount of knowledge you have about all these different cases. And hearing you talk about it, it's just really impressive, like how immersed you are in this topic. So I have a few suggestions with the aim of like, how can you tighten this up before you submit it for review? So one thing that I would have appreciated more in the paper is if you could spend a bit more time clearly spelling out the theoretical expectations of all these explanations that you're going through, right? So tell me more about what regional politics looks like for us to expect to see exit, voice, or loyalty. Maybe tell us a bit more about economic interests and how, you know, under certain conditions with these economic interests, we expect to see exit or voice or loyalty, right? Of course, that means that's going to lengthen the paper, right? And journals have word counts. So one thing that I think you could do to keep it under a certain word limit is maybe some of these explanations are pretty easy to refute. So, if pressure is constant across time, right, but we're seeing variation in exit voice or loyalty, that might be something you can kind of do away with pretty quickly in the introduction or the contribution of the paper and say, look, if pressure was a really important explanatory variable here, but it's constant across time, then we don't really need to engage with that explanation so much. The other ones that you don't find so much support for, I wondered if some of them could be booted to the appendix and say, for readers who are interested in this set of explanations, I don't find a lot of empirical support for them. So I'm going to move those as well as the empirical evidence for them to the appendix, right? And the last thing I'll say is I would also like a bit more discussion of how these different explanatory variables are measured. So I think for your outcome here, exit voice and loyalty, it's really impressive how you went about coding all these different statements. And then for the key explanations that would stay in the body in the paper, if you want to shorten it and move some to the appendix, I would like to hear a bit more about how you operationalize them. Anyway, so all my comments are really just with like, how can you kind of lengthen where I think it could use some lengthening, and then where could you save some space? But it's a really great paper, and I look forward to seeing it published one day. So thanks for sharing.
Awesome. Thanks, Megan. I saw that Geoffrey had his hand up, but I think he put it back down. Geoffrey, did you have a question, or maybe it got addressed?
Yeah, I had a question. Yeah, so Maxine, thanks so much for the wonderful article. I also enjoyed reading it. And I think I've also read some of your work initially. So my question was, I was wondering whether you were stretching this exit function too far to include many African countries, because for me, I see it as much of a function of Kenya, because we see the attempts at withdrawal from the ICC, especially at the AU level, more collectively. It was a function of Kenyan elites, especially when we had Kenyatta case and Ruto's case. And once the two cases collapsed, we didn't see much of African countries talking about exit. And perhaps we only saw the Vazilas Burundi because of their own domestic affairs. The political elites, they were also susceptible to the ICC. So don't you think it was too ambitious to extend this idea of exit to the rest of African countries, as opposed to just being a Kenyan function? Because it more of looked like helping their colleague, the regional colleagues in Kenya, Kenyatta and Ruto, to overcome the ICC. Then once that was over, then it became less of an issue to most African countries. How do you grapple around with that, the centrality of Kenya in the exit debates?
And so let's just collect one more comment, Maxine, and then you can address the comments. So thanks, Geoffrey. Fiona?
Yeah, hi. So this is a very small comment at this point, because I think a lot of the feedback you've gotten has been really substantive. So I don't have like that much to add to it, other than I really enjoyed reading the paper, and I think that this is a really important understudied topic. So my main suggestion is about data visualization. So right now you have this like very detailed table in the main text, and I think that if you're going to submit this paper as like a standalone article, I would just recommend maybe moving that really detailed table to an appendix, and then in the main body of the text have some kind of quick and dirty visualization. So a lot of the entries in this table, I think they're like frequency counts. And so if you had some kind of bar plot, or maybe like a dot plot that just shows us sort of over time which of these state actors are voicing their demands for exit, but some kind of visualization of this like very detailed table, I think would help improve the flow of your main narrative. And then for people who actually want to see like the core content of what's actually being said and how that varies over time, that's something that you can relegate to a more detailed back end in the appendix. But otherwise, I thought it was really great.
Thanks, Fiona. All right, Maxine, I'll turn it over to you.
Cool. Thank you. Sorry, yeah, data visualization is one of my absolute weaknesses. as well as brevity. So thanks for the recommendation. And yeah, it's definitely something I'll look into. Probably just to clarify, the 1, 2s, and 3s are actually just for if the color wasn't to work. So if you do submit to a journal and it gets grayscaled, it's just so that you would still know that 1 equals exit even without the color red. Sorry, that actually should have been written in. Okay, so with regards to stretching exit too far, I think the exit category is useful. I think that we do have 3 cases that, you know, actually demonstrate exit behavior, even though it's South Africa and the Gambia then rescind on that. And I do explain that behavior and why and what drove that, both actually with kind of regime changes and a domestic case. So I think exit is still useful for capturing this behavior. And it's also, I think, important for highlighting, I think, basically what you're saying, which is that, you know, there was a lot of discussion, or like there was a lot of rhetorical mileage that was gained from threatening exit, which is an act of voice, but we don't really see this happen. And that's something which is to be expected within an IO, and it's to be expected because that's where your power lies, right? And I think we have this like kind of funny occasion of events that actually see some states leaving because this narrative around exit starts moralizing some states' withdrawal, right? It gives, you know, 3 states this kind of bigger kind of legitimizing reason to justify what's kind of self-interested reasons and a damaged reputation in South Africa's case. And it makes it look like you're taking some moralistic stand against, you know, the marginalization of Africa and by the ICC. So maybe I need to bring that out more, or maybe it's just something which we disagree about. I found the exit category useful, and I don't think I overused it because I used quite a narrow definition of exit. I feel bad kind of referring to the Boehm paper when the author's not here to defend herself. But one of the things that she did was she defined exit as including threats of exit, which is something that widens the pool of exit behavior, and I quite strongly disagreed with that. And so, yeah, I thought I had quite a conservative approach to how I operationalized exit, which was when the actual withdrawal clause of the ICC was used. Unless I misunderstood the concern you raised, Geoffrey. But yeah, thank you. And I think also kind of highlighting that how it was used as a function of elite interest rhetorically is something which I maybe need to emphasize a bit more. I think that was a really good point that you noted. Yeah. And then, yeah, and then Megan, yeah, thank you for your advice about kind of what I can emphasize and de-emphasize and making use of appendices, which I'm totally abusing in my PhD, but I could definitely abuse in this as well. So thank you very much. I think I've addressed everything, Justine.
Great, this sounds great. So are there any other questions?
If I could just make one brief comment. Firstly, let me say how much I enjoyed reading the paper and how much I enjoyed this model and analysis that arise from it. I would just stress one point, which I think, which may be a little repetitive, but I think it's important, and that is the danger of taking at face value statements made by politicians. I think that it will be helpful to go behind some of those statements in some cases. I mean, the South African situation is interesting. The whole motivation for withdrawal, in fact, came from the African National Congress, not the government. It was a resolution taken by the ANC instructing the government to withdraw. This was obviously motivated by Zuma. And I think Zuma was influenced firstly by his friendship with al-Bashir, certainly judging from body language and arms around each other's shoulders at frequent meetings. But the ANC resolution is the reason that the withdrawal legislation is still before Parliament, technically. It hasn't been withdrawn by the government because that would be inconsistent with with an ANC resolution. So I think it's important, at least in some cases, possibly, and it's a question it's really the question Phil raised as to scope, but certainly some attention might be given in some cases to the facts behind the statements which are made. Thank you.
Can Michelle respond?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Right. Sure. I think Justice Goldstein, what you say makes me realize, and maybe I need to elaborate more on my use of discourse analysis, because for each country statement, I classified the states after applying 3 dimensions of discourse analysis, which looks at basically what the immediate influences are from the forum in which something was delivered. So this is just to deconstruct the discourse itself that was used and how something was delivered. What other external influences might have been at play in terms of global politics. So taking into account those power relations, often the UNSC was very relevant here. And then in my examination of the explanations of behavior, and kind of part of what motivated, kind of going beyond, well, this is just a classification of behavior and that's good enough. It's actually, well, what drove this behavior? And then it does start challenging what they say. So Burundi's explanation, when it withdraws, it gives 2 speeches, and it's, kind of really moralizes what it's done. It says it's doing it because of a popular mandate from its domestic citizens. It's doing it because it can no longer kind of allow for the ICC to treat African states like this. It's not abiding by complementarity. But then if you look at contextual factors, it is very obviously responding to the fact that Bensouda had just announced that they're going to investigate. They've launched preliminary investigations into Burundi, right? So it's very obviously reacting to that context. And it doesn't acknowledge that there was popular protest against what was happening, what Burundi was doing, and that its own officials, and I think this really affects the point that Oumar Ba made around, actually maybe it's better to define this one explanatory variable as political elite interest as opposed to the head of state. And it's because other officials are also implicated. So maybe the fact that I didn't take the country statements at face value wasn't made clear enough in my explanation of my method or my methodology and my approach there. So I'll revisit that and maybe just elaborate a bit, and perhaps in an appendix give an example of how I kind of did that kind of appropriate allocation of states into the different categories. So thank you. And thank you everyone very much for taking the time to be here, and APCG for organizing this, and my 2 discussants whose work I really appreciated in the writing of my thesis and in this article. So yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to give me feedback.
Yes, thank you everyone for participating. Just going to put in a plug. We are accepting applications for next semester's APCG Colloquium. You can find us on Twitter. So please apply, encourage your students or colleagues to apply as well. Thanks so much to Maxine, Oumar, and Phil, and for a great productive conversation. All right, see you next time.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Justine. Thanks, Maxine.